Okay, to start, the reason we're here, Jeff Tumlin, and what a treat this is for us. We've been wanting to feature Jeff for some time, and just really was fortunate that it worked out, Jeff doing work here in Vancouver. So a quick Google of Jeff, what do we find? Jeff Tumlin is single-handedly changing the way America thinks about transportation. Yeah, well, fortunately that's true, as you will see. But I wanted to find out a few interesting things about him. He's an LA boy, brought up in Linwood. Yeah, right, where's Linwood? Well, he's straight out of next door to Compton, for those of you who know Los Angeles. And this is interesting, he operated the submarine voyage at Disneyland. Where he had to be a union member because it was a motor vehicle. All right, so you can see how that would shape your now in San Francisco, he is with, well, we know him very well, with Nelson Nygaard, one of the singularly most important firms really advancing the transportation agenda in the States and around the world. He's actually part of the Abu Dhabi cabal. And for those of you who know a little bit of the planning history of Vancouver, when Larry Beasley went over to Abu Dhabi to do some of the planning for them, he brought some of the real stars of our community and Jeff. I asked him what was one of the more interesting projects he's worked on. Get this, he was part of a team that was looking at moving the capital of Russia to the suburbs of Moscow. That never happened, thank God. So Jeff, welcome back to Vancouver. Gosh, we should make you an honorary citizen along with the Abu Dhabi cabal. Yeah, we'll think about doing that. Come on.
Thanks, Gordon. I really love being here. I am an urban planning nerd, and as an American and as an urban planning nerd, I've always had this sort of grass is greener view of Vancouver, and spending this week working out at Phibbs Exchange for TransLink and the District of North Vancouver, I'm actually very pleased to notice that there are some dark brown splotches in the much greener, otherwise greener lawn of the greater Vancouver metropolitan region. It's a tragic place and it needs a lot of help, and so I've been grateful to be here for work. But I'm also really glad to be here because in so many ways, as an urban planning nerd and as an American, I see this region, and particularly the city of Vancouver, as the first and only great modern city in the world. And it gives me a lot of hope. It's sort of like visiting the future, a sort of better future, where I can imagine how the rest of North America might be transformed by what you all have been doing here over the last couple of decades. It's also a place, and oh my God, look at this, we have a sold-out house. To hear you know, a nerdy lecture about transportation planning policy stuff. Oh, but of course, I know why you are all here, because of the first word in this which is actually part of the theme of this presentation. While there's a small part that is in fact about sex and about neuroscience, a lot of it is about how we imagine place and how we sell place and ideas and how we've been duped for much of the late 20th century by the industry of motordom into believing that having and driving a car will give us sex and freedom and autonomy and status and belonging in a host of other things that fortunately people are starting to believe is a lie. And so one of the things that I would encourage all of you to do as you're listening to this presentation is, where have you been told lies and how can we fight the forces of evil by using their tools and coming up with a better vision for what our cities can be? So I'm going to talk about a bunch of stuff tonight, a little bit about what the problem is, and then really focus on 8 simple and very importantly 3 steps that all of you and that every municipality can do in order to make a more successful, more fun, sexier place. And one place that I'll start, and this is another theme of this presentation, is one of the great mistakes I think of modernism is they recognize that one of the aspects of the human animal that has allowed us to be incredibly successful is our adaptability. They, however, I believe, overestimated our adaptability and underestimated how narrow the habitat is, both in terms of our physical habitat and our social habitat, how narrow that habitat is in order to create health and happiness. And so the public health industry, unlike my industry in transportation, has been fantastic about creating data and doing before and after studies. And one of the things that the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta has been tracking across the United States is rates of obesity. They've been mapping this dutifully. They've been doing this since about 1985. And you can see that there's some clusters of adults, 10 to 14% of people obese in the sort of Rust Belt states. And they've been tracking this over the years, 89, 90, 91 had to change the scale. We've got some more obesity there. 92, 93, 4, 5, 6, 7, change the scale again. 98, 99, 2000, 2001, 4, 5. We're now significant chunks of the country, greater than 30% of adults, clinically obese. 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, there's actually data for the last 2 years I didn't include, but an astonishingly rapid change in the health of American citizens, all of which has tremendous both economic, medical, social costs and also in terms of the costs of how people are relating to each other and their whole vision about themselves and their role in their community. A dramatic change in a very short period of time, much of which is related to the fact that people in my country are now no longer able to have a significant amount of walking as part of their daily lives. Part of this is diet, but a big part is that we've redesigned the human habitat to take walking out of our daily equation. And this is all despite the fact that every single city in all of those states, including the places that have greater than 30% rates of obesity, all of them have civic policies that are all about creating mixed-use neighborhoods and walkable places and livability and lots of walking and biking and reduced vehicle travel and complete streets and honor motherhood and enjoy apple pie. And yet, the rules, the performance metrics, the design requirements, all of the DNA of these communities require that this be built. It is in fact illegal in most cities that I work in to build anything but this, and I'm glad to be here and the fact that this is an exception. And in fact, the rules, when you go in and look at the DNA, particularly in the transportation world, the design requirements, how we conduct traffic impact studies, the rules about development, parking requirements, all of these little technical requirements that only people in my wonkish world even understand the acronyms for, let alone how the equations were put together. This is what all of those requirements force us to build. And you'll notice, this is, do I have a laser pointer? Maybe. Yes, I do. This is mixed-use development, right? So here's some shopping, there's some apartments, here's some employment, here's some services, and indeed, it's pedestrian-oriented development, right? Because you've got sidewalks, you have some landscape, there's lighting, it meets like all of the rules for pedestrian requirements. Like this is awesome. And in fact, there's even a pedestrian. So clearly, this is working, right? Wrong, right? So not only are our rules creating absolutely miserable places and forbid us from creating the places that we all love. In fact, in almost every city that I have ever worked in, if anyone's favorite place were to burn down to the ground, their favorite place, the most economically successful place, the place that everyone loved, if that burned down to the ground, it would be illegal to replace it. And what we would have to replace it with, we know, is not only going to be less economically successful and generate more traffic and more pollution and more congestion and all these bad things, but it's also going to kill us, right? We've got abundant data now that sprawl results in greater rates of fatality and shorter life expectancy. The data is all over the place, and we know that all of these things are conspiring together in order to create more CO2 in our atmosphere and result in more climate change. In California, where a lot of my work is, about 40% of total CO2 emissions in the state are a result of transportation, more than buildings, right? Driving around creates more CO2 than our buildings, and of that 40%, that is transportation, over 70% is personal driving. It's not even the airplanes or the trucks or the ships. It's individual people driving their kids to school. And so if we want to have any chance of saving ourselves from the most brutal impacts of climate change, we have no choice but to design our communities to make it not only possible to not drive for every trip, but delightful. We're not going to be successful if we pry people's hands off of their steering wheels or take away their cars under the cover of darkness. In order to make any difference in climate change, we need to make it more pleasurable in order to walk, bike, or take transit for all of your everyday trips than it is to drive. So that driving becomes something like the automobile commercials promised it would be, the fun of driving on the open road for the weekend, right? We can accommodate some of that, but not every day. The other thing that we've noticed, and the science behind this is actually quite fascinating, is road rage is now a clinical condition. And the brain chemistry is actually really quite fascinating, as well as the social science behind it. So, as social primates, we get an enormous amount of information from body language and eye contact from other human beings. So, when I'm out walking down Granville, coming down here, the streets are crowded with pedestrians, completely packed with pedestrians. None of those pedestrians were running into each other. People were not saying, oh, excuse me, but I'm going to go to your left now, so please go to the right? No, you don't have to say that. You don't have a little sign. You don't have to have blinkers on your belt, right? We know through the subtlest of gestures, the slightest tilt of the shoulder, the direction somebody is intending to go to. We know through the slightest flick of the eye an enormous amount of information about people's intended movements. And if, for example, you happen to, that breaks down, and you bump somebody in the shoulder, the slightest tilt of the head and dip of the shoulder is enough of an apology to say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. And a nod of the head is enough to receive forgiveness, and it is completely forgotten. So all of the incredible complexity of our social world that serves us so well, navigating downtown streets, or hunting in packs, which is really where it comes from in evolutionary biology. It's the reason why our species without claws or sharp teeth succeeded so well, is because we learned all these social signals so that we could hunt in packs. When that breaks down, we get very upset. So when you're in the carapace of a motor vehicle and somebody cuts you off, there's no way of knowing whether that person who just cut you off is sorry or even knew that he cut you off, or is really trying to mess with you, right? And so your reaction, immediate, unconscious, is to get into a defensive posture, and in fact, the brain releases the whole array of chemicals that are very effective in the fight or flight response. So the amygdala of the brain releases a bunch of chemicals that tighten the muscles, heighten aggressiveness, quicken the responses, make you less interested in thinking through the consequences of your actions. That in turn causes the hippocampus to release another series of chemicals that in turn causes the prefrontal cortex to basically shut down social behavior. Road rage is a result of brain chemistry that is a result of a breakdown in communication that happens when we're expecting to receive social signals and we cannot because of the speed and distance and big metal boxes that we're in our car. It literally drives us crazy. And it's okay for this to happen every now and then. But one of the things that happens when the amygdala is constantly firing this soup of toxic chemicals into the brain that are preparing you to square off with your enemy is that it creates permanent changes in the brain. Permanent changes in the brain that make you mistrustful, angry, less able to handle complex reasoning, certainly less able to think through the consequences of your action. more antisocial. In fact, it's my belief, when you look at voting records in the United States, there is an overwhelming correspondence between Tea Party membership and the absence of sidewalks. It's true. People without sidewalks vote Republican. And so if we have any hope of creating a more civil society, a thriving democracy, which requires people to have sort of mutual trust, we cannot have people trapped in their cars. At least we need to have them trapped in their cars a lot less than they do now. So what we find in all of this is a fundamental mixed message of our policies telling us one thing, and all of our requirements and measures of success telling us something completely different. So what is the solution? Well, I think the biggest part of the solution is to recognize the limitations of the human body itself and our psychology, to recognize what makes us happy, and to start with happiness, and then to adjust from there. So there's a lot of data about how the physical form of places influences human behavior and human happiness. We know that as density increases, rates of driving decrease dramatically. That's sort of simple math. And it's particularly interesting in the level of density that is effectively the streetcar suburbs of the 1920s and the 1930s. While I love the density of downtown Vancouver, I mean, it's fantastic, it's elegant, you're cramming a ton of people here, it's incredibly efficient. You don't need this density in order to have a dramatic impact on human behavior. What you need is 2 or 3 stories, townhouses, walkable retail, basically the way we designed urbanism in the 1920s and the 1930s. Perfect balance of access to the automobile when you need it, but never having it be a requirement. To be leafy and green and suburban, and still allow the automobile to be optional. It's fantastic if you can get this density, but again, not required. The other thing that we know from statistical research is that if you want to improve the safety of walking and biking, there is by far no more effective thing to do than to increase the number of cyclists and the number of pedestrians. And how do you do that? You do that by making walking delightful and by making cycling safe and comfortable for people of all ages, not just the hardcore liker crowd that can put up with pedaling really fast on scary highways. The other thing that we need to recognize is the impact of our combination of the car on our social capital. And how many of you have you read Donald Appleyard's seminal work, Livable Streets? Yes, a few of you. Not very many of you. Donald Appleyard, write this down, Livable Streets, did some of the most interesting social capital research on the relationship between how we do transportation and how invested people are in their communities. And quantified it, in fact, and found a remarkable difference in, based upon the speed and volume of traffic on residential streets, a dramatic difference in how well people knew their neighbors, to the point where on streets with high traffic volumes, like nobody knew anyone across the street, to the opposite extreme of streets that were narrow and had low traffic volume. There were a preponderance of people who had given their keys to their neighbors in case they had gotten locked out or needed somebody to take care of their pets. So it's a very interesting way of measuring how transportation has an impact on social cohesion and on people's participation in democracy. Even more interesting is the increase in research on how different approaches to transportation impact individual mental health. And some of the most fascinating research is about the relationship between outdoor exercise, regular outdoor exercise, and individual mental health. It's particularly intriguing for people who have mental health issues. Getting people who maybe are marginally able to live in a non-institutional environment that have some significant mental health issues, significant improvement in their ability to deal with society if they get regular exercise outdoors. And a remarkable benefit for those of us who can at least fake our way in civil society. Like, we're much happier and able to actually participate in civil society if we get exercise regularly, and particularly outdoors. I'm sure that is true for many of you in this room. You've noticed this. But the thing that is most interesting is the recent research about the release of oxytocin in the brain and what causes it. So oxytocin is this very interesting neuropeptide that's released from the pituitary gland. And it has a bunch of very complex responses in the body. It lowers blood pressure. It helps to reduce the negative impact of other stressors in our body and in our lives. Most importantly, though, it increases positive social behavior, mutual reciprocity, and trust, generosity, and empathy. And oxytocin is released into the brain under very specific sets of circumstances. And here's where we get to the title of the presentation, because the most common way that the brain releases oxytocin is in breastfeeding and in orgasm. And it is so powerful at creating trust. It is, in fact, the biological basis for trust that is actually marketed commercially. You can buy a little spray of oxytocin. Clinically, they don't really know whether this has any effect, but it's enough to have people pay $50 for a little spray bottle of it. It is something, perhaps you've noticed, those of you who have experienced the joy of breastfeeding, but all of you who have experienced orgasm, there is a marked attitude change about whoever you are with after orgasm, right? There's like all this sort of interesting brain chemistry that's going on. And one of the things that's interesting about oxytocin in particular is that it's different from the other pleasure chemicals in the brain, dopamine or the endorphins or the morphine groups, in that it is longer lasting. So with the opiates, you get a high and then it collapses. With oxytocin, the effect of it lingers and it can be additive. The other way in which oxytocin is released is with human eye contact, particularly within the context of orgasm. But more importantly, for the purposes of this evening, is oxytocin gets released with outdoor exercise, not indoor exercise. We do not know why this is the case. But jogging, walking briskly, bike riding outside, particularly bike riding with other people, releases oxytocin in our brain. And in fact, many of you may have noticed that when you've gone on a long bike ride outside, like out on the seawall, perhaps with a special friend, your attitude about that special friend, like at the end of the ride, like, wow, life seems good. Like, I'm a lot happier now. My attitude about my place and my future, it's different, right? We all experience that. And we experience that. That's not an anomaly. That is your brain chemistry at work. And it's something that we can use to help create a better society. Because, oxytocin is good. I like it. So the question for all of us is why, when we know from abundant clinical evidence that driving too much makes us fat and sick and die early and poor and dumb and angry and mistrustful, and walking makes us fitter and smarter and more able to handle complex reasoning and sexier, yes, and more loving and more trustful, why in the transportation world are we focusing all of our effort designing around this rather than around this or around this? So what can we do in order to solve this problem? Well, there are 8 steps that I will leave you with, and this is where things get kind of wonky. The first, I may call too many of these the important step, a very important, rather complicated, but actually essential to all the other steps, is measuring transportation success in a less stupid way. Transportation performance measures are embedded in so much of our decision making. We use them to decide how to time that traffic signal out there. We use them to decide what projects get funded and don't get funded. We use them in development review to decide whether, how big the project can be and how much does it have to pay to widen the roadway. We use them all kinds of crazy things. And the bulk of our decision-making about transportation focuses in most communities on a single measure of success called level of service, which measures the seconds of delay that automobiles experience, typically at arbitrary intersections, as calculated through complicated models. But in order for us to measure what actually matters, it's important for us to understand what transportation is for. Transportation is not an end in itself. There is nothing that I do in any of my work that in and of itself serves any good. What I do is I allow other good things to happen. We're just sort of like creating the sewer system. Sewer system in and of itself, not that great. However, it has tremendous benefits, right, that we all enjoy. Transportation is exactly the same way, and so we need to make sure that our transportation investments relate to real benefits. Transportation also has kind of two big components. One is about mobility, and this is kind of what we focus on, which is making it easy for people to get around to do whatever it is that they want to do. And so it's adding traffic lanes, it's putting in bike paths, it's extending transit lines out to wherever. But there's another part of transportation that is about accessibility. So movement in itself doesn't really serve a purpose. Getting people the stuff they need, that does serve a purpose. Or getting people to be able to hang out with their friends, that serves a purpose. And so in addition to extending roads or transit lines, we can also move stuff closer together or use technology in order to eliminate the need for movement but still achieve the larger goal. But if what we're focused on is level of service or seconds of delay that cars experience on a roadway, it can force us to make some sort of odd decisions. So this is my city, this is San Francisco, and this is pre-1989 when we had this lovely double-decker freeway cutting our city off from the waterfront. And this was a perfect solution to a transportation system that that valued level of service above other considerations. And by that same measure, a thriving, vital commercial street like Market Street, where people were shopping and there was transit and stuff going on, that was terrible because there was congestion there. The worst thing in a level of service-focused world is a successful shopping street. That's really bad. And so, how you measure success very much depends upon your perspective. So a crowded street to a traffic engineer that's full of people spending money, that's level service F. And an empty street where there's no one out in the street and no one's spending money, that's level service A. Awesome, you've done a great job. However, of course, to an economist, the perspective is reversed. To an economist, that street is being fully utilized. That capital resource is being used to its fullest, most valuable extent. And of course, that empty, barren street, not only is no one spending any money, but somebody spent an awful lot of money to build a lot of infrastructure that is achieving no public benefit, right? So think about your perspective and what you value. And consider not only, delay for cars, but other things that transportation can do, like economic development. On a commercial high street, the transportation performance measure that should matter the most is retail sales per square foot. Who the heck cares how traffic is flowing so long as people are spending their money? On a residential street, seconds delay for cars is, maybe interesting, but residential quality of life is probably a lot more important. What's the impact, on children's safety? Can kids play in the street? Can kids get themselves to school? Where are the benefits and costs of our transportation system investments accruing? Who benefits? And are we subsidizing the most privileged people in society and putting the cost burden on the lower income people or more disadvantaged people? And similarly, how are our transportation investments affecting our ecological sustainability goals? So if you want your transportation investments to meet your larger community goals, it is absolutely essential that your transportation performance metrics reflect your larger goals, and it is absolutely essential that those metrics be quantifiable. So my industry, engineers, many engineers, there's probably many of you in the room, you're lovely people, I'm sure, but you like numbers, right? So if it's not quantifiable in my world, it is going to be ignored. So find ways of figuring out what your values are and how you quantify whether or not you've achieved them. And there's a lot of different techniques out there. Many communities are experimenting around with different approaches to performance metrics, including not only looking at level of service for cars, but level of service for other modes of transportation. So, for example, if you're looking at seconds delay per vehicle, people who are on a bus, so if you've got 40 people on a bus and one person in a car, level of service says that people on that bus are valued at 1/40th of the value of that citizen driving alone in her car. So you can think about other ways of making sure that you are capturing what you care about. But if I can leave you with one performance metric that matters above all else, it is about making walking a pleasure at all times of day for all types of people. If you can make walking work, every other mode will sort itself out, and you will have an economically and socially successful place. Never sacrifice walkability in order to improve level of service for other modes of transportation. So, step number 2. Don't be stupid about your traffic analysis, and understand what goes into traffic analyses. And this is one of the areas in which my industry is great at obfuscation. We've got the coolest tools that are full of fascinating math. In fact, one of my friends, a friend of mine, is a fantastic modeler, and he's super, super nerdy, and loves figuring out the factors that influence travel behavior by like 0.01% and like including them in the model. Not realizing that there are factors in his model that are kind of plus or minus 20%. And when you have factors in your model that are out to 17 significant digits, but you're multiplying those against factors that have, at best, one maybe significant digit, you're not making your analysis any more accurate. Another thing that's important to understand about models is that while they can be exceedingly useful for comparing alternatives against each other, they are no better than tarot cards at predicting the future. So don't believe us when we tell you the model results said that this doesn't work. Ask the right questions about how those results were gotten to and what the assumptions were that were built in. And make sure that the models are smart about the factors that really do influence human behavior. In fact, I think one of the fundamental problems about the traffic engineering world is that it's much better seen as a branch of economics than it is as a branch of civil engineering. What we do in traffic engineering is primarily about predicting human behavior, and the factors that support changes in human behavior are exceedingly complex. Much more complex than the factors that determine what the right super elevation is for banking a freeway on-ramp or how to make the drainage work. So other things that are important to understand about traffic modeling are some of the unintended consequences of model-based decision-making. Most of my clients suffer from the problem of having the model predict an increase in traffic generation. Going to build a couple buildings, this many more people are going to drive, that's going to result in increase in congestion. In order to reduce the congestion, we need to go and we need to add, a couple more left turn lanes here, And this is some roadway widening that occurred as a result of the environmental analysis. So, add a couple lanes here and there. The result, of course, of adding these lanes and making it easier to drive is one then makes it that much more difficult to do anything other than drive. When the traffic analysis said that this road needed to be doubled in width, it now made it very difficult to walk across that street as a pedestrian, which therefore made it very difficult, if not impossible, to take transit, because you may be able to get there in the bus, but you can't get home. So one of the problems with models is that they create the problem that they predicted. So there are a variety of solutions to this. I'm probably not going to get into most of this wonkishness. Maybe I can come up with the questions and answers. Some of the approaches to getting rid of this modeling problem really focus on the factors that do influence human behavior and ask the question, not how much wider do we need to make this road in order to eliminate the congestion problem, but rather what are the bike and pedestrian and transit investments that we need to make and the management techniques that we need to put in place in order to accommodate this development without increasing traffic, as the city of Vancouver has done exceedingly well. It's also important to understand how the models work and to open up the black box of travel demand models to the light and understand that they're actually very simple, despite our efforts to make all of you not understand them. So for the most part, models look at, they start with land use, various land uses, office building, a hotel, some residential. And from that, you estimate how many total trips those uses are going to generate. And typically what we do is there's this big book, you open up like this, and it has data from Florida in the 1970s that we slavishly copy and say, we're certain that this is the trip generation out to 6 decimal points. And then we decide, okay, so it's going to generate this many trips. What percentage of those are going to be vehicle trips versus, walk and bike trips? And then we, oftentimes use what we call professional judgment, because most communities don't have very good tools of predicting mode choice, except to copy what has been done in the past, or worse of all, to copy the trend line of what had been done in the past, except for the trend line that's happened recently of an absolute collapse in rates of driving and auto ownership. So we assume, well, we better accommodate the worst case scenario, right? Because we don't want there to be congestion. So after you estimate vehicle trip generation, you then figure out where the trips are roughly going, and then you assign those trips to individual streets, and then you step back and you measure. And you can see the congestion patterns. You get your little elementary school grading system where, as an engineer, if I get an F, it's like my kids getting an F in elementary school. It's shameful. It's terrible. So what happens then? Well, if you start off with a problem that's making everyone very sad, which is congestion, it makes me sad. You say, okay, well, we can solve the congestion problem, right, by widening the roadway, right? That's great. It makes everyone happy. Driving is faster. Well, the problem with making driving faster is now it's a smarter choice than walking or biking or taking transit. Or now I can decide, well, there's this awesome job that's an additional 15 miles away. Now it doesn't take me that long to get there. I'm going to switch jobs, or I can go live in that cheaper housing farther out in the suburbs and still drive in. And so the result of that is, of course, more people drive, which brings us back to congestion and makes us sad again. So then you go through the model, and of course the solution is to widen the roadway. We end up with a problem that we see in so many auto-dependent suburban locations everywhere in North America, and a model that's being copied all around the world. So what's wrong? Well, of course, we have used our models inappropriately, and by assuming the worst case scenario in our approach to transportation have in fact created the problem that we were trying to solve. So if we were smarter and actually focused on human behavior and looked at the factors that we're all making every day in our decision making, we can come up with better results. And it's oftentimes a lot easier than many people think it is. So traffic engineering and congestion patterns are very granular. There are some magical thresholds in congestion whereby on the most congested street, if I just remove 10% of the cars, that street is free-flowing again. So oftentimes I hear as I'm going around helping communities solve these problems, like, oh, well, you can't expect everyone to take transit, or everyone's not going to ride their bike, or more importantly, people don't want to ride their bike, which of course is code for I don't want to ride my bike. So if I don't want to ride my bike, nobody's going to ride my bike, therefore everybody's going to keep doing the same thing, and this is hopeless. Well, you can get 10% of people to do anything. 10% is nothing. 10% of people will try any crazy thing, as any advertiser knows. So the congestion problem is in fact very easy to solve if we actually plan for it and model it and incorporate all of the key factors that actually influence rates of driving, mostly about land use. And Larry Beasley, who I love working with, very wisely said once that the best transportation plan is a good land use plan. So starting with density, starting with a mix of uses, starting with building along transit, starting with making sure that the cores of your region are the places where the transit lines cross on the map. And then of course managing it all, pricing, parking. Yeah, I guess we're allowed to talk about roadway pricing in this crowd. We'll get to that later. All of these things can allow us to continue to have economic development and growth without suffering the curse of traffic congestion. Number 4, adopting the right street design manual. This is something that I can't believe isn't done yet. In my world, most of the principles in the old school world of street design come out of the rural highway engineering profession. When you're on a rural highway, you can increase safety by widening the travel lanes, putting in shoulders, making the curves more sweeping, cutting down all the trees, and basically, and you're on a long country drive, and you're sort of nodding off, and you start drifting in the other lane, or you're texting while driving, or had maybe just 2 drinks. Accommodating driver error, in fact, enhances safety. The problem is the opposite is true in urban conditions. And we know this from the data, and yet our urban design and street design manuals continue to believe in a one-size-fits-all solution for better streets and particularly for street safety. We know from the data that in an urban context where there's chaos and things going on and pedestrians, that the most important thing to do is to increase the perception of danger on the street in order to get drivers to slow down and pay attention, right? Safety is about slowing down and paying attention in an urban context. Driving is dangerous. Giving drivers a false sense of security is the worst possible thing that you can do. In fact, most of the things that make driving safer in an urban context, citizens will swear people are going to die. It's so dangerous. Like, you can't narrow that lane. You can't tighten that corner. You can't put a tree in the corner or in a median. That's going to cut the sight lines and people will die. That is not substantiated by the data. In fact, the data tells us the exact opposite. So, very easy thing to do. Use an urban street design manual for urban streets, and you don't need to develop your own, just copy somebody else's. There are many very special and unique things about your community. The needs of its streets are not among the special and unique characteristics. You can copy somebody else's manual. And there are great manuals out there. Even the old school Institute for Transportation Engineers has a very good context-sensitive solutions manual. Even better is the National Association of City Transportation Officials, which has a fantastic bikeway design guideline that has been influenced by your work here in Vancouver, and is coming out with an urban street design manual that we're working on later this year, which will be free. Point number 5, plant trees. Trees are awesome. Don't really need to say much more about them, other than the fact that you need to make sure that the costs of planting and maintaining trees and dealing with the utility and pavement disruption that trees entail, that those costs do not accrue to the people who do not benefit from the trees. The cost of tree planting and tree maintenance should accrue to the folks that benefit from it, which is adjacent property owners. And that's a whole other story, but don't expect your public works director to love trees if she has to pay for them, right? Find another source of money for making the trees happen and for maintaining the asphalt. Point number 6, this is an important one, is about pricing it right. I don't know why this is true. For every commodity in our society, in order to balance supply and demand, we use one technique, which is price. Whether that is for food, or for clothing, or for housing. You know, for my cell phone bill, I spend more on like my data plan for my cell phone than I do on driving. It's expensive. And I get free calls, like evenings and weekends, which is pretty awesome, but it's very expensive to use my phone during the day. But the benefit of paying a lot of money for my cell phone is I don't have to dial 17 times in order to get through. The opposite is true for everything having to do with the car, whether it is roadways or parking. We use the Soviet communist method of balancing supply and demand for only one thing in our society, and that is how we handle the car. And the result of that is, when you don't use price for balancing supply and demand, you end up using the equivalent of a bread line in Soviet Russia, which is congestion. Not an efficient way of managing our incredibly expensive transportation system, nor for dealing with the horribly painful and wasteful impact that it has on the time of people stuck in that congestion or the goods movement that results in economic disruption. And yet, we continue to insist that driving and parking be free, as if it were in Leviticus or something. People who, I love actually working down in Orange County, California, where my clients are like rabid libertarians, like absolute fiscal conservatives, like no government involvement in anything. The market should solve all problems except for the problems associated with driving, in which massive government subsidies and production quotas have to be met every year in order to continue our pursuit of a greater communist society. So, why not the transportation sector? I don't really know the answer to this question, but it was fascinating to me. So Sweden, in Stockholm, one of several cities around the world that recently implemented congestion pricing cordon around the perimeter of the city. When the city council in Sweden implemented that congestion pricing cordon, I don't know the statistics, I'm just going to make them up. But something like 75% of the voters were adamantly opposed to congestion pricing around the perimeter of Sweden. People hated it. It was extremely controversial. I have no idea why the city councilors in that city voted to impose them and how they survived the next election. But after 6 months after it was imposed, and congestion was eliminated from the city of Sweden, and they had a ton of money to invest in improvements to transit and walking and biking, they did another survey, and the same 75% of people said, oh yeah, I always wanted congestion pricing. I don't know why it took them this long to implement it. Like, what, damn council, lazy, we've always wanted this. After you actually use the market and you realize that people who are complaining like, oh, well, if we price the roadways or price parking, where would the poor people park? Or isn't that just like a Lexus lane that's just for the rich? It's fascinating to me that nobody ever actually asks the poor people what they want. And in fact, in San Francisco, the congestion pricing study that was done there was fascinating in that, lo and behold, poor people actually place a very high value on their time. Many poor people are really struggling and have multiple jobs and kids, and would gladly pay more to be able to cook dinner for their kids, or to be able to get to their second job on time. What we find is that the price elasticity of demand for most roadways is small enough that it is very easy to get the 10% mode shift that is needed with relatively modest increases in price. What I think many people don't understand is that congestion pricing is not roadway tolling, where you're paying for the privilege of using the roadway. Congestion pricing is merely making sure that we can maximize the use of the roadway investment and keep our roadways flowing smoothly at all times. The right price for roadways and the right price for parking is always the lowest price at which the streets are free-flowing and a few parking spaces are available. Interestingly, the right price for any good in a market-based economy is the lowest price at which production and demand are in balance, right? That's how the market works. Why not in transportation? Which brings us to the seventh and probably my favorite topic, which is parking, where people are crazy on the topic of parking. The most rational people that I deal with have the weirdest cognitive dissonance on the topic of parking. So, this is I think this is Moscow, where we just were, and it's Moscow. Our adventure in doing planning for Moscow with a whole host of other stories. But one of the things that's fascinating to me about Moscow is that Moscow, the city of Moscow, does not have the authority from the Russian federal government to be able to charge for parking anywhere within the city. All parking is free and completely unmanaged, and as a result, parking happens wherever you can get it. It's the worst of all possible worlds, where it is impossible to drive or park or walk or take the bus. It's complete chaos. Even in sort of like modest, neighborhood high streets or small downtowns across North America, as much as 30% of the traffic in a downtown environment is people driving around circles looking for an empty parking space. And if you remember that a 10% reduction in trips results in an elimination of congestion, simply by managing parking better, we can eliminate congestion. Done. Easy. Everyone is happy. Why are we not doing it? Similarly, why are we not taking advantage of technology in the parking world? It's stuck in this weird 1950s dead zone, for the most part, where no one has done any thinking in such a long time, when we know that it's very simple to put wirelessly networked little devices in parking spaces that communicate with each other and can let not only the city know about parking utilization patterns, but you can actually sell that information to service providers to help people find a parking space. I can go online right now and know exactly where I can find an on-street parking space in San Francisco, and signs will tell me where to go. The most important thing is to set the right price for parking. And what this means, given the rule that the right price for parking is the lowest price at which a few spaces are always available, is that the price of parking needs to vary by time of day and by geography. The on-street spaces need to always be more expensive than off-street spaces. Core downtown spaces need to be more expensive than the farther away, and the spaces in front of the destination are more expensive than the spaces behind. All of this to achieve an availability target. And how many of you have read Don Chut's book, The High Cost of Free Parking? All right, I need more hands, right? Okay. If you're this much of a, if you're claiming to be an urban planning nerd, absolutely required reading. Parking is destiny for most cities, and every city that I've been in is stupid about how it manages parking. So what else? Set the right hours of enforcement. If your retail district is primarily a restaurant and nightclub district, why do the meters stop running at 6 p.m.? The reason you charge for parking is not to raise revenue, but rather to make sure that customers can always find a space. You will always, as a city, make more money off of a successful commercial district than you are off of your parking meters. So, City of Pasadena, California, parking runs until midnight on Fridays and Saturdays, and yes, they actually charge for parking on Sunday, even though I'm almost certain it does say in Leviticus that parking will be free on the day of the Lord. The reason why cities don't charge for parking on Sundays is because when they implemented parking meters back in the 1950s, stores were closed. And they haven't updated their policies since 1955. The world has changed. So other things to think about is taking your parking meter revenue and investing it in something that makes a difference. Pasadena, California takes all of its parking meter revenue and gives it to the Downtown Business Improvement District to use as mad money. They steam clean their sidewalks every night in Pasadena using parking meter revenue. Other things to do, unbundle the cost of parking from the cost of commercial leases or residential leases. Why in your community do you force residents to buy more and more parking than they need? Do you want to encourage people who own more cars to live in your community? Why do you force commercial tenants to lease more parking than they need? Do you really want commercial tenants that are going to generate more traffic? Why not separate the cost of parking from the cost of other things and let people self-select who would enjoy living in your community because maybe they are not stuck driving in their car? Another really important thing to consider is to create park once districts. So if you imagine strip commercial, so this is lovely Marine Drive, where I just was in the district of North Vancouver earlier today. And Marine Drive has an array of uses along it. So there's school and shopping and work and soccer fields, and each of those uses has its own minimum parking requirement. And you'll notice that the parking lot is bigger than the building itself, because in most communities, the parking area that's required is greater than the building area, because cars are big, right? And people are driving. So imagine a typical trip. So Dad is driving down Marine Drive. He drops Sally off at school, and then he goes to work, and that requires a parking space. And then he goes and he picks Sally up from school, and that requires another parking space, and he drives her to soccer practice, because of course she can't walk across the horrible arterial. And then he goes and does some shopping, and that requires another parking space. And then he goes and he picks Sally up, and he goes home. And obviously, this is sort of compressed a bit, but this is like many people's daily life. And you'll notice that this spaghetti of traffic is not only creating a lot of parking spaces, but an awful lot of turning movements off of the major arterial, which are having a disproportionate impact on congestion. So imagine instead you have your big arterial, but instead you have a grid of streets, and you take those same land uses and you array them along a grid of streets rather than along the strict commercial, horrible, hideous highway. And then you have them share parking. So you can cut the parking area in half. That's how it works. So you imagine the same trip. Dad drives, he finds a parking space, Sally walks to school while he goes to work, and now Sally can walk herself to soccer practice. And Dad can pick up, laundry and the groceries on the way back to the car. He can meet Sally, and off they go. The exact same set of trips, and yet radically different impacts. Half of the parking, half of the land area, or twice as much economic development potential per hectare of land. A quarter of the arterial trips, 1/6 of the arterial turning movements, and less than a quarter of the vehicle kilometers traveled, simply by rearranging your land uses to focus on the pedestrian and being smart about how you handle parking, creating a park once district where somebody can park once and do 6 different things rather than requiring a parking space for every single land use. So the final point that I want to leave you with is arguably, I think, what is most important, and that is creating a better vision for the future of our cities. I think we have a horrible limitation right now, in that when we think about the future of the cities, we don't have a clear vision in mind. In fact, we've been fed so much information about what we should want and how we should think about transportation that we're clouded in our vision. So this has been going on for a long time. So this is an advertisement from 1923 in the Saturday Evening Post, and it's actually worth reading even though we're sort of going over time, but this is fun. 1923 advertisement for the Jordan Playboy, that car. Somewhere west of Laramie. Somewhere west of Laramie, there's a broncho-busting, steel-roping girl who knows what I'm talking about. She can tell what a sassy pony that's a cross between grease lightning and the place where it hits can do with 1,100 pounds of steel and action when he's going high, wide, and handsome. The truth is, the Playboy was built for her. Built for the lass whose face is brown with the sun when the day is done of revel and romp and race. She loves the cross of the wild and the tame. There's a savor of lynx about that car, of Laughter and lilt and light, a hint of old loves, saddle and squirt. It's a brawny thing, yet a graceful thing for a sweep of the avenue. Step into the Playboy when the hour grows dull with things gone dead and stale. Then start for the land of real living, with a spirit of the lass who rides, lean and rangy, into the red horizon of Wyoming twilight. Some of the best ad that's ever been built, and a vision that we are still buying into about what our automobile can do for us. And this has continued through time. I mean, using sex to sell cars is one of the most universal tropes in our society. And it continues on. Even to sell a nerdy electric car still requires the use of sex to convince us to put out, you know, $80,000 on this hunk of steel because it's going to transform our lives or make us more powerful, more appealing, transform our dull office lives, because magically we're going to be out there on the open road, you know, having some wilderness adventure. When we know, in fact, that what driving is actually like is this, yet we still believe the lie, and we believe the same lie with our cities. So, our vision of the future of cities is stuck in 1933 from the Chicago exhibition, the Futurama exhibit, one of the most popular exhibits in the history of any kind of international exhibit, only to be topped by the Futurama exhibits of the 1939 and 1964 World's Fairs. Futurama was sponsored by General Motors. And I believe in the 1939 World's Fair, again, I'm not going to get this right, but I believe 1/3 of the population of the United States saw this exhibition. By far the most viewed industrial exhibition ever, and certainly viewed and more influential than any public exhibition of anything in the history of the United States. And the vision is compelling and thrilling at the time. I mean, you know, these images are just delightful, and of course they've influenced all aspects of popular culture, including the Jetsons. How many of you have seen the Jetsons? How many of you under the age of 30 have seen the Jetsons? This is astonishing to me, that a cartoon that was put out for only 2 years back in 1964 still drives our vision. You ask somebody to draw a picture of the city of the future, they're drawing something from the Jetsons, which is basically a copy of the 1933 Chicago Industrial Exhibition. And it's influenced everything. It's influenced, it drove Disneyland, which, you know, has influenced me very powerfully, having worked on the submarine voyage, which is right there. That's where I go. You know, Disneyland, particularly Tomorrowland, it's an orgy of transportation. Like that's Walt Disney was the ultimate transit nerd. And one of the core rides in Disneyland, and one of the few rides that has survived the changes to Tomorrowland, is the Autopia ride, because you need to train them while they're young. And so, even at Disneyland, in Tomorrowland, the Imagineers at Disneyland are deeply concerned that Tomorrowland, which used to represent this incredibly hopeful, inspiring vision of the future, has resorted to this incredibly kitschy, quirky Yesterdayland. And the Imagineers at Disney, perhaps some of the most creative people in the world, have yet to come up with a vision for the future of the city that's better than the one from 1933. And so that's really the task that I need to ask of all of you. If there's anyone in the world that can come up with a compelling vision for the city of the future, it's going to be you all here in Vancouver. And it's going to start with the physical needs of the human body and our social and psychological needs, building off of Maslow's famous hierarchy, where you can't get to morality and creativity in civil society until you've met the base needs of our physiological needs, our sexual needs, and our family needs. So I'll leave you with some ideas to get you started thinking, and then we can go to questions and answers. So one theme I think that is critical for the future of great cities is that, as we've said before, that walking is a pleasure everywhere, for everyone, on every street, at all times of day. That great cities live or die, first and foremost, according to the quality of the walk experience. If you can make walking delightful, everything else will work. Secondly, and this is particularly important in our lower density communities, and particularly important as demographic and market preferences change, that cycling needs to be comfortable for people of all ages, including kids, and including an old lady who can no longer drive and who needs to carry 2 sacks of groceries. And the way to do this, as most of you know, is to create separated cycle facilities that appeal not just to the 3% of us who feel comfortable riding in traffic or riding in some narrow bike lane next to high-speed cars, but for the 80% of the population that is interested in cycling but doesn't yet feel comfortable doing so. And again, this is particularly important for the lower density places. Cycling is the salvation, the economic salvation of our suburban communities. As younger people these days are not interested in driving because it cuts them off from their social networks, the way to not have a collapse of real estate value in the suburbs is to continue to make them accessible to transit by taking advantage of the bike. It also means that the car needs to be optional. It needs to, maybe we can continue to have our fantasies about Wyoming sunsets, but the needs of daily life need to be available within walking distance. And so fostering concentrations of retail nodes within walking distance of every neighborhood is something that we should all be focusing on as planners and figuring out how to cultivate the retail ecology in order to make that work. Very importantly, transit needs to be fast, frequent, and reliable, and just as importantly, it needs to be dignified. People who take transit need to feel like they are actual equal citizens. We were discussing today over at District of North Van about advertising panels in bus shelters, and I pointed out the Mercedes dealer across the street from the bus shelter could make a lot of money selling advertising panels inside every Mercedes that he sells. But he's not going to do that because that's not the experience that Mercedes buyers are looking for. The same needs to be true for transit. It needs to be dignified and it needs to be sociable, which is one of the key things that transit can do to outcompete the automobile. Another key factor is that everyone needs to know and love their neighborhood. We are fundamentally tribal social primates. We identify with a group, and we identify with a very specific kind of geography that's about the size of Siena. And so breaking down, particularly in a mega region like this, the impersonal and not quite social nature of the big region into smaller constituent parts and having clear boundaries, clear centers, and clear programs to make people feel a sense of ownership and belonging to their neighborhood is absolutely essential. Another key point, and this is much larger and goes beyond transportation, but that both food and energy are local and precious. I think very importantly, and this is getting increasingly important as time goes on and as demographics change, that social networks are fostered. In fact, as I have hinted at before, these devices may be our salvation in the transportation world, because while my generation believed the lie that having a car would bring me freedom and autonomy and status and power and sex, the current generation realizes that it's quite the opposite, that those things are achieved through this. And when I'm in a car, I can't use this. I'm cut off from everything that gives me what I want when I'm trapped in a car. On the bus, I can still use this. And so that's actually quite interesting. On the bus and on a bicycle, more importantly, I can not only make discretionary choices about like stopping off and going wherever I want, but I can flirt, and I have the opportunity to carry that flirtation further. And going back to the sex theme, I used to believe when I was in college and learned about the sort of economic proximity theory of why cities form, and businesses get close together, and you have the coffee shop next door, and so on.
I quickly realized that that was complete nonsense, and that cities exist for sex. People, young people move to cities to get laid. And I've since refined that as I've gotten older, I guess, and realized that, in fact, and when you go and you start reading about the neuroscience of this, it is in fact true, that it is not so much sex that is important, but the possibility that as social primates who equate our own sense of worth with our interactions that we have with other people, in fact, flirtation is many, many more times more valuable than the actual culmination of flirtation. And so fostering public spaces that facilitate social interaction, and in particular informal lingering and eye contact, are going to be essential to the future of cities. And this, Nygaard writes about this extensively. And one of the things that I've been waiting for someone to write about that I haven't seen yet is details like the importance of lighting. If the lighting is not very good, including the tone and color of the lighting, if I don't look my best, I'm not going to want to hang out in the place because you want to look your best, right? And retailers know this, restaurants know this absolutely. High-end supermarkets spend a fortune on lighting to get the color just right, and actually to foster the flirtation experience at Whole Foods or whatever your local equivalent is here. Whole Foods knows that they're not just selling produce, they're selling an experience. And so applying the same factors that every retailer or restaurateur has figured out to the public realm is going to be critically important to the success of cities. And finally, and I think most importantly, is that we recognize that beauty is of fundamental importance. A place is not sustainable if it is not beautiful. Our brains are biochemically hardwired to value beauty and to protect and maintain things that are beautiful and that we value. One of the most fundamental rules of sustainability is that it's always more effective to make better use of what you've already got than it is to build or get something new. If we want our cities to endure, and if we want our cities to thrive, and if we want our cities to be a delightful, enticing, seductive alternative to auto-dependent motordom, then they must be beautiful. And with that, one minor plug. I've written a book about some of these things. I have 3 copies for sale up front. If you would like to buy one, it's all will fit in my carry-on bags. And with that, I am happy to take any questions. Thank you.